All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. So today we're going to pick up talking about our specific nervous system and the way that our nervous system is organized. So first and foremost, just recognize that nervous systems in general, ours or otherwise, really are there to process information in three major stages or steps. First and foremost, I need to get that sensory input. What is the stimulus? Whether I'm perceiving that through visual information, whether I'm getting it from touch or smell, that information needs to get put into that organism itself from its environment. Or it could also be something internal, um, internal pressure, internal pain, things like that. So that sensory input, wherever it's coming from, then needs to get integrated. And that integration piece generally occurs in the brain itself, in our central nervous system. And then ultimately, that integration of information, that brain then decides what to do with that information and how to respond to it. And that's really your motor output. So, overall survival of organisms really depends on these concepts of sensation and perception. First and foremost, your body needs to be aware or sense that there's a change either in its internal or external environment so that the brain can then decide what to do with that change. And then ultimately, the perception of that stimulus, what's the interpretation? Is this something dangerous? Is this something I need to deal with? If so, what is my body's sort of homeostatic mechanism set up to do in order to adjust to that change? So, your neurons are the major piece to getting information to and from your central nervous system. And then there's plenty of neurons built into that central nervous system to get that information to your brain and back out. So your nerve cells, they're sort of your highway system for information within the body. And your body's going to really utilize two major types of signals. The electrical signals, which we're going to take and utilize sort of over long distances. How do I get information from your brain all the way down to the muscle in your foot? Well, that's going to take electrical impulses to get there. It's a long distance to travel, as opposed to chemical signals, things like neurotransmitters, or even perhaps neurohormones that we mentioned back in the last section. But these guys are only going to work over short distances because those chemicals need to diffuse from one cell to the next. And remember, diffusion of anything is not particularly efficient over long distances. So it only really works in situations across good short distances to be effective. So, when we look at the system of organization specifically with regards to neurons, we've kind of got three major categories of neurons that exist in the human body. First ones are your sensory neurons, and these guys are your sensors. These are the ones that are detecting stimuli. You've got lots of them in things like the tips of your fingers, in your lips, things that are going to detect external stimuli and then send that information off to the brain. They also are all over the place in terms of recognizing internal conditions as well. Um, but regardless, sensory input goes along these sensory neurons, and these are sort of what you're looking at here. All right, you've got these dendrites, which are these highly branched pieces. You've got your axons, which are big connection pieces, and then your cell body. This is where all of your mitochondria and Golgi and all of that sort of traditional organelle stuff is going to be located there in that cell body. You then have another set of neurons that will take sensory input sent to the brain or sent to ganglia if they don't have a true organized brain like we do, where they will actually integrate the information. And these are your interneurons, which is what you're looking at here. And look, the structure looks considerably different. A lot more branching going across those axons. And as well as across those dendrites. And then you've got your motor neurons here, which also look considerably different. Huge, huge dendrite, your cell body's up here. And then you've got that long axon down at the bottom. And those motor neurons are the ones that are leaving the brain, taking that information, taking that effector message, and then ultimately moving that information to trigger a muscle or trigger gland activity, whatever the case might be, that your brain has decided this is what's going to be the next step in dealing with the stimulus that had come in the first place. So when we look at the overall organization in the human body of what those nerves are, where they exist, how they function, we really break your nervous system into two pieces. You've got your central nervous system or your CNS. This is where all the integration takes place, and this includes your brain and your spinal cord or your nerve cord. Your peripheral nervous system or your PNS is what's carrying all of that information to and from your central nervous system. So if we go back to your neuron types, I should say, your sensory neurons, your motor neurons, these guys are mostly the ones that are hanging out in your PNS, your peripheral nervous system, and then your central nervous system is mostly these interneurons integrating and interpreting the information that it's getting in. If we look at the nerves of your PNS, they do get bundled together as a way to track where they go. So we talk about them as nerve bundles, or you may come across them as nerve cords. Those also get split into two major pieces. Your afferent neurons, these are your input information, those sensory neurons carrying information to your central nervous system, and then your afferent neurons, which would be your motor neurons carrying the information away. So let's dive into that peripheral nervous system for a second, because we do talk about sort of two pieces to this itself, your autonomic nervous system versus your nervous system. What do you have control over as opposed to what is pretty much your brain is just sending these signals and taking care of this involuntarily? So your autonomic nervous system, this is what's regulating your smooth muscle in things like your digestive tract, so your stomach, your intestines. You don't have to think about the contraction of those muscles in order to move that waste and that digestion process along. These are generally the ones that are involuntary. Same thing in your cardiac muscles. So you're not thinking, oh, hey, my heart needs to pump. Hey, my heart needs to pump. Hey, my heart needs to pump. You never have time to think of anything else. So that autonomic nervous system is exactly what it sounds like. It's automatic. Your brain is already designed and hardwired to just take care of that system without you having to have any voluntary control over it. Your motor system, on the other hand, this is the one that you do have voluntary control over, even if you never really thought about it. So it's really carrying most of those signals to your skeletal muscle system. You're telling your feet to walk. You're telling your hand to pick up that pencil. You're telling that hand to write down these notes. All right, that is all something that you are voluntarily controlling. If we dive into that autonomic system, then we can also break that down as well. So you've got your sympathetic, your parasympathetic, and your enteric divisions of your autonomic system. Sympathetic, this is the one that's going to regulate arousal and energy generation. Really, this is for the most part your fight or flight response. You're like, oh my God, I've got this big presentation, my heart's pumping, right? Or I've just gotten into some really sticky situation. I got to get myself out of it. Do I fight my way out? Do I flee? So that's very much sort of a old evolutionary process, right? Your parasympathetic is antagonistic to that. So anytime we ramp up your sympathetic division, your parasympathetic gets driven down. And when we're trying to get you kind of back to normal, calm you back down, go back to sort of that rest and digest function, that's where your parasympathetic division comes back in and calms and returns everything back to normal. You also have an enteric division that specifically controls your digestive tract, your pancreas, and your gallbladder. So, really taking care of those sort of more digestive specific, waste removal specific systems in your body. So, if you take a look, all right, here is just sort of what triggers these pieces. So, if I take a look at my parasympathetic, right, actions on target organisms, so sort of that resting piece will stimulate salivary glands because we want you to digest foods. We're going to constrict the bronchi because you're bringing in enough oxygen again. You slow down your heart. But if you look at the sympathetic, look at the opposites. So I'm going to inhibit that salivary gland. I don't want to spend the energy and time secreting all of that enzyme when I'm more worried about running for my life instead. Relax the bronchi to bring in more oxygen, accelerate the heart rate, so on and so forth. So just kind of something interesting to take a look at what sympathetic versus parasympathetic looks like in an organism. Something else that's interesting as part of your motor system are these ideas of reflexes. So, although your motor system overarchingly is voluntary, there are a handful of pieces where stimuli will just automatically produce a response without really needing to go all the way up to your brain. And reflexes are a great example of this. So, if you've ever been to the doctor's office, they check your reflex, right? They use that little hammer, hit your knee. That information is that stimulus, I should say, is gonna come in to your spinal cord, but rather than going directly up into your brain, instead it's going to use an inner neuron to decide what to do, send that motor neuron right back out, and you swing your foot. So it's sort of this knee-jerk reaction, and there's a good reason for this, especially when we're talking about sort of that fight or flight piece. There are certain situations where we need that information there almost instantaneously rather than it needing to go to your brain, get processed, and send that information back. You've got certain reflexes there that are meant to take care of the issue, hopefully, without needing to wait that lag time. Gag reflex is another one. You've got something in your mouth. Well, we don't want you to choke, so the time that it would take to get that information to your brain, process it, and get that reflex in place to get that whatever object is in your throat back out would take too long. So that information directly goes to your spinal cord, gets processed, and sends an informational signal right back out to that motor neuron to sort of cough it up. Speaking of your motor system, sensory pathways overarchingly have four basic functions in common. So let's take a look at what those look like. So first and foremost, I need that stimulus to be received, right? So sensory reception is really going to be the first key path in any basic input information. So I need to detect the stimuli by those sensory receptors. And I also need to be able to distinguish what kind of input I'm taking in. Is this big input, small input, right? And so it really is a matter of both pressure, frequency. All of this can dictate how many signals I'm sending up that sensory neuron in order to allow my brain to get a better fine-tuned understanding of what the stimulus is. So sensory reception is bringing that information in. Do I have gentle pressure? Do I have lots of pressure? Am I stimulating multiple receptors at once? Or am I only stimulating a few? So that transduction then is the actual convergence of that signal and conversion of that signal to energy in your membrane's potential of the receptory response. So what we talk about is a response is graded, and we'll talk about graded transmission systems in a little while. But what we're doing here is if it's only gentle pressure, for example, right, somebody just kind of brushed up against you, you may only send one signal, right? So there's sort of this low frequency action potentials or electrical signals being sent up that sensory neuron. If it's a lot of pressure, we're going to increase the frequency of those action potentials so that your brain can understand the difference between a light touch versus a forced grab, for example. Same idea here, how many receptors am I setting off? If it's only a slight ding, right, lower frequency because I'm only setting off a couple of those receptors at once. But if it's a lot more pressure, right, this is where I'm going to activate way more receptors and get that more higher frequency potential. So it's not only just sending high frequency from one sensory receptor, but from multiple as well. If you've ever taken two pencils and moved them further and further apart, your ability for your brain to recognize the difference is huge, versus very sharp versus very dull. All of that kind of stuff you can kind of test on some place like your hand that's generally relatively sensitive, or the tips of your fingers, and you can feel the difference. Why? Because your body is capable of distinguishing all of these different pressures, sharpnesses, and things like that. And it's really important for your brain to have that ability to understand that information so it can decide what to do about it. So once you've gotten past that transduction piece, now I'm going to move or transmit that information to your central nervous system. So we'll do this via electrical signals. More importantly, more specifically, we'll talk about how action potentials get generated and sent a little later. But for now, just recognize them as sending these electrical impulses to your central nervous system. Once that information makes it to your central nervous system, now I need to integrate it. I need to perceive it. So your brain has to interpret that stimuli. So the more information it can get from here, the better that perception is able to interpret that signal. So it's got to distinguish between different stimuli. Where are they coming from? How much signal is coming in? To what degree? So that your brain knows what to do. And when we look at receptors, we're really going to talk about 5 categories so that your brain not only can distinguish frequency and how many I'm setting off, but more specifically, what type of receptors am I setting off? So you've got mechanoreceptors, which is more what this picture is showing you here. Things like pressure, stretch, motion, sound. So things like your eardrums or you use station tubes and being able to know, are you up or down? Chemoreceptors, things like your mouth and your nose, being able to transmit information about solute concentrations in a solution, whether that's a smell or a taste. You've got electromagnetic receptors in things like your eyes to be able to detect light. Thermoreceptors, both surface temperature as well as external temperature. So you've got those both internally and externally, as well as pain receptors to things like excessive heat, excessive pressure, chemical burns. They are also internal, so you will set these guys off from any sort of damaged or inflamed tissues in your body as well. If you take a look, this is kind of just an interesting picture. So you've got your 2 cortexes, your motor cortexes. You've got your primary motor cortex, which is closer to your frontal lobe, out in front of your brain, versus your primary somatosensory cortex, which is just behind that, back just in front of your parietal lobe. But if you take a look, here's where the basic information is coming from in terms of where in that cortex approximately it would get received, as well as this particular picture. It looks kind of funky. If you look at the scaling of different organs or different structures in your body, that organization is done on purpose. That exaggeration of, say, your lips, for example, is on purpose because you get a lot more sensation, a lot more information from that particular spot in your body, as opposed to, say, something like your fingers or your forearm. There's a lot less densely packed sensory neurons in those areas. So, although very strange looking, the disproportion is important because it's showing where that information comes in and to what degree that part of that body has in terms of densely packed neurons. So your spinal cord really is your connection point here. It is what's going to transmit all of that sensory input in and up to the brain, as well as be what sends the signals back out. It also can help, as we mentioned a few slides ago, produce those reflexes independently of your brain as well. So invertebrates overarchingly have a ventral nerve cord, so it kind of runs down the front of them, sort of belly side. We are vertebrates, so ours is a dorsal cord along our back. And when we look at those nerve cords, they are really what's going to give rise to that central canal and ventricles in your brain. So you've got these channels and hollow pieces, if you will, these ventricles in your brain, just like ventricles in your heart. And that's where we fill up cerebrospinal fluid. So that fluid, its job is to filter things from your blood, oxygen, nutrients, that kind of stuff, as well as waste products back out of the cells that it surrounds. It also is there to cushion your brain, cushion your spinal cord, so on and so forth. So if you've ever heard about the brain blood barrier, the blood itself doesn't actually cross into your central nervous system, or at least it's not supposed to. So if you've ever seen somebody get a spinal tap where they take that cerebral spinal fluid out of their spinal cord and it's red, that's not a good thing. That blood is not supposed to be there. The cerebrospinal fluid's job is to carry all of that nutrients and waste back and forth, much like your blood would, but only in your central nervous system. Here's those ventricles I just mentioned a second ago. So here you can kind of see in a cross section. Here is what you would see if we cut it the other direction. And then your brain itself is also an interesting organizational structure. So you've got this gray matter out here and white matter on the inside. And what that really comes down to when we look at your neural structure, your neuron structure, is that those neural cell bodies, dendrites, they are all unmyelinated, meaning there's no coating on the outside of those long axons we just saw a few slides ago. So that's why this looks more gray. On the inside, you get all of that myelinated axons, so kind of sort of this fatty material that surrounds those neural structures that you don't get on the exterior of your brain structure, but you do on the inside. So that's where this distinguishing factor between gray matter and white matter really comes in to that brain structure. If we take a look at the brain's development and organization itself, all of these brain structures are specifically divvied up for certain functions eventually in your body, or they'll take care of certain pieces of processing information. And those structures really start way back in very early embryonic development. So here you've got an embryo at about a month, so about 4 weeks out. At this point, mom may not even know she's pregnant at this point. Most women won't get their first ultrasound until about 8-9 weeks, unless there's a more higher risk. That's generally how long they'll wait. So this will be way past even this point. All right, but if you look, your embryonic regions right here, you've got your forebrain, midbrain, hindbrain, and then those start splitting out into these segments, which ultimately become these generalized brain structures in your adult. So you can see where this all falls out. So it's just kind of an interesting thing to look at where they all fall in. And a lot of that organization starts really, really early on in development. Once again, potentially before mom is even aware that she is pregnant. So a lot of that brain development happens very early, which is why they're very cautious about alcohol consumption, because what can that do to that early development, as well as things like folic acid. Folate has a lot to do with that early brain development, and if your body is not capable of processing that folate or producing it, getting it out of your foods very well, that can have a huge impact on this early brain development. If we look at the brain's general structure once we get to an adult, this is kind of what you're seeing. So you've got your cerebrum up here, your cerebral cortex, your corpus callosum, all right, your basal nuclei, and then your cerebellum's down here, sort of your what they talk about as your hindbrain versus your high brain, right? So it's most cognitive function is happening up in that cerebellum, particularly your frontal lobe, and this is sort of more your animal brain, if you've ever heard somebody refer that to it that way. You've got your midbrain here, your diencephalon. Here's your pituitary, hypothalamus, pineal glands. We mentioned those in your endocrine system, so that's sort of where all of that process is structured, located. This one's kind of interesting. This one takes you through, again, basic pieces of your brain structure, but now gives you a little bit more understanding as to what those pieces connect to in terms of processing of information. So you've got something like your prefrontal cortex, which is decision making, planning. So if you get brain damage here, individuals will have a hard time with those particular processes. Just here, your Broca's area, formation of speech. So again, stroke or other brain injury that might happen here, you would have a hard time developing speech patterns. If we talk here, just behind your ear is your auditory cortex, so in your temporal lobe. Comprehending language back here. Visual cortex, so although your eyes are all the way up here, we actually process all your visual information back here in your occipital lobe. Okay, and there's your control of your skeletal muscles and your motor cortex, sense of touch in that sensory, somatosensory cortex. Parietal lobe is a lot of your sensory association, so integration of that sensory information back here.
This morning was a typical morning for me. I woke up thinking about that dream that I keep having about the guy in the sloth suit, and then I got dressed because I was cold, and then I made some toast with butter because I was hungry, and then I let the dog out because she was whining and staring at me, and then I made some tea, but I let it cool off before I drank it because it burned my mouth yesterday. In addition to being just part of my morning ritual, all of these actions are examples of what my nervous system does for me. The weirdo dream, the sensation of cold air and hot tea, deciding what to put on the toast, going to the door, the sound of the dog, all that was processed and executed by electrical and chemical signals to and from nerve cells. You can't oversell the importance of the nervous system. It controls all the things. All your organs, all your physiological and psychological reactions, even your body's other major controlling force, the endocrine system, bows down before the nervous system. There is no you without it. There's no me without it. There's no dogs without it. There's no animals. There's no things. There's things. It's important. That's why we're dedicating the next several episodes to the fundamentals of the nervous system, its anatomy and organization, how it communicates, and what happens when it gets damaged. This is Mission Control, people. Even though pretty much all animals, except super simple ones like sponges, have a nervous system, ours is probably the most distinctive feature of our species. From writing novels to debating time travel to juggling knives, all of your thoughts and actions and emotions can be boiled down into three principal functions: sensory input, integration, and motor output. Imagine a spider walking onto your bare knee. The sensory receptors on your skin detect those 8 little legs. That information is your sensory input. From there, your nervous system processes that input and decides what should be done about it. That's called integration. Like, should I be all zen about it and just let it walk over me? Or should I not be zen and freak out and run around screaming, "Spider!" Your hand lashing out to remove the spider and maybe your accompanying banshee scream is the motor output, the response that occurs when your nervous system activates certain parts of your body. As you can imagine, it takes a highly integrated system to detect, process, and act on data like this all the time. And when we talk about the nervous system, we're really talking about several levels of organization, starting with two main parts: the central and peripheral nervous systems. The central nervous system is your brain and spinal cord, the main control center. It's what decided to remove the spider and gave the order to your hand. Your peripheral nervous system is composed of all the nerves that branch off from the brain and spine that allow your central nervous system to communicate with the rest of your body. And since its job is communication, your peripheral system is set up to work in both directions. The sensory, or afferent division, is what picks up sensory stimuli, like, hey, there's an arachnid on you, and slings that information to the brain. Your motor, or efferent division, is the part that sends directions from your brain to the muscles and glands, like, hey, hand part, how about you do something about that spider? The motor division also includes the somatic, or voluntary nervous system that rules your skeletal muscle movement, and the autonomic, or involuntary nervous system that keeps your heart beating and your lungs breathing and your stomach churning. And finally, that autonomic system too has its own complementary forces. Its sympathetic division mobilizes the body into action and gets it all fired up like, ah, spider! While the parasympathetic division relaxes the body and talks it down, like, it wasn't a black widow or anything, you're fine, breathe. So that's the organization of your nervous system in a nutshell. But no matter what part you're talking about, they're all made up of mainly nervous tissue, which you'll remember is densely packed with cells. Maybe less than 20% of that tissue consists of extracellular space. Everything else, cells. The type of cells you most likely heard of are the neurons, or nerve cells, which respond to stimuli and transmit signals. These cells get all the publicity. They're the ones we're always thanking every time we ace an exam or think up a snappy comeback to an argument. But these wise guys really account for just a small part of your nervous tissue because they are surrounded and protected by gaggles of neuroglia, or glial cells. Once considered just the scaffolding or glue that held neurons together, we now know that our different glial cell types serve many other important functions, and they make up about half of the mass of your brain, outnumbering their neuron colleagues by about 10 to 1. Star-shaped astrocytes are found in your central nervous system and are your most abundant and versatile glial cells. They anchor neurons to their blood supply and govern the exchange of materials between neurons and capillaries. Also in your central nervous system are your protective microglial cells. They're smaller and kind of thorny looking and act as the main source of immune defense against invading microorganisms in the brain and spinal cord. Your ependymal cells line cavities in your brain and spinal cord, and create, secrete, and circulate cerebrospinal fluid that fills those cavities and cushions those organs. And finally, your central nervous system's oligodendrocytes wrap around neurons, producing an insulating barrier called the myelin sheath. Now, over in your peripheral nervous system, there are just two kinds of glial cells. Satellite cells do mainly in the peripheral system what astrocyte cells do in the central system. They surround and support neuron cell bodies, while Schwann cells are similar to your oligodendrocytes in that they wrap around axons and make that insulating myelin sheath. So don't sell your glial cells short. They're in the majority cell-wise, but of course when it comes to passing tests and winning arguments, most of the heavy lifting is done by the neurons. And they're not all the same. They're actually highly specialized, coming in all shapes and sizes, from tiny ones in your brain to the ones that run the entire length of your leg. But they do all share three super cool things in common. Number one, they're some of the longest lived cells in your body. There's a lot of debate right now about whether you're actually born with all the neurons you'll ever have, but some research suggests that at least in your brain's cerebral cortex, your neurons will live as long as you do. Cool fact number two, they are irreplaceable. It's a good thing that they have such longevity because your neurons aren't like your constantly renewing skin cells. Most neurons are amitotic, so once they take on their given roles in the nervous system, they lose their ability to divide. So take care of them. And number three, they have huge appetites. Like a soccer-playing teenager, neurons have a crazy high metabolic rate. They need a steady and abundant supply of glucose and oxygen, and about 25% of the calories that you take in every day are consumed by your brain's activity. Along with all these wonderful qualities, your neurons also share the same basic structure. The soma, or cell body, is the neuron's life support. It's got all the normal cell goodies like a nucleus, DNA, mitochondria, ribosomes, cytoplasm. The bushy branch-like things projecting out from the soma are dendrites. They're the listeners. They pick up messages, news, gossip from other cells and convey that information to the cell body. The neuron's axon, meanwhile, is like the talker. This long extension or fiber can be super short or run a full meter from your spine down to your ankle. We've got a few different axon layouts in our body, but in the most abundant type of neuron, the axons transmit electrical impulses away from the cell body to other cells. For us students of biology, it's a good thing that nerve cells aren't all identical because their differences in structure are one of the ways that we tell them apart and classify them. The main feature we look at is how many processes extend out from the cell body. A process, in this case, being a projecting part of an organic structure. 99% of all your neurons are multipolar neurons with 3 or more processes sticking out from the soma, including one axon and a bunch of dendrites. Bipolar neurons have 2 processes, an axon and a single dendrite, extending from opposite sides of the cell body. They're pretty rare, found only in a few special sensory places like the retina of your eye. Unipolar neurons, on the other hand, have just one process and are found mostly in your sensory receptors. So if you ever find yourself probing around someone's nervous tissue, remember these 3 terms to help you figure out what you're looking at. But because we're talking about physiology here as well as anatomy, we have to classify these cells in terms of their function, and that basically comes down to which way an impulse travels through a neuron in relation to the brain and spine. Our sensory, or afferent neurons, pick up messages and transmit impulses from sensory receptors in, say, the skin or internal organs, and send them toward the central nervous system. Most sensory neurons are unipolar. Motor, or efferent neurons, do the opposite. They're mostly multipolar and transmit impulses away from the central nervous system and out to your body's muscles and glands. And then there are interneurons, or association neurons, which live in the central nervous system and transmit impulses between those sensory and motor neurons. Interneurons are the most abundant of your body's neurons and are mostly multipolar. Okay, it's applied knowledge time. Let's review everything we've learned so far in terms of that spider on your knee. Those 8 creeping legs first activate your unipolar sensory neurons in the skin on your knee when they sense something crawling on you. The signal travels up an axon wrapped in Schwann cells and into your spinal cord, where it gets passed on to several multipolar interneurons. Now, some of those interneurons might send a signal straight down a bunch of multipolar neurons to your quadriceps muscle on your thigh, triggering you to kick your leg out before you even know what's going on. Other interneurons will pass that signal to neurons that carry it up your spinal cord to your brain. That's where your body first recognizes that thing as a spider, and the connections between neurons interpret and split the signal so that you can either scream and start swinging your arms wildly about, or remain calm and with dignity remove the spider from your person. It's all based on the connections between neurons, which brings me to a whole new question. How? How in the name of Jean-Martin Charcot do nerve cells use chemistry and electricity to communicate with each other? It's one of the most stupefyingly awesome and complicated aspects of your nervous system and basically of all life, and it is what we will cover in our next lesson. Today, you learned how sensory input, integration, and motor output of your nervous system basically rules your world. We talked about how the central and peripheral systems are organized and what they do, and looked at the role of different glial cells in nervous tissue function. We also looked at the role, anatomy, and function of neuron types in the body, both structurally and functionally, and how everything plays out when you find a spider crawling on your skin. Thank you for watching, especially to all of our Subbable subscribers who make Crash Course possible for themselves and for the whole rest of the world. To find out how you can become a supporter, just go to Subbable.com. This episode was written by Kathleen Yale, the script was edited by Blake DiPestino, and our consultant is Dr. Brandon Jackson. It was directed by Nicholas Jenkins and Michael Aranda, and our graphics team is Thought Cafe.